Man, I am glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
I got Mike Pierce here, a.k.a. Antarctic Mike, who I saw you 10 years ago give a presentation that was just awe-stricken to me. I was so motivated. I think because the theme was employee engagement. I think that was the theme of the talk that you gave. I know you have more talks, but Mike, why do people call you Antarctic Mike?
I became fascinated with Antarctica back around the year 2001. What happened was I used to be a headhunter, and I was on a recruiting trip up in Bakersfield, California, of all places. And I was driving back to my hotel, and I didn't have a book, and I like to read. This was in the old days, and this is going to shock some of your viewers. This is in the old days when telephones only made phone calls. I know that's really a mystery for some people, but you couldn't get the book on the phone the way you can now. So I walked into something called a bookstore, right? They used to make these. And I walked in and I saw this Antarctic history book sitting on the end cap of an aisle in the business section of the store. And I'm like, what does this have to do with business? It was this old black and white photograph similar to the one you have up on the board there behind you. And I'm like, what in the world does this have to do with business? So of course I picked it up and started thumbing through it. And within about 10 minutes, I got it. And I bought the book and then I couldn't put it down. I read it in like 3 days and I'm not a fast reader. Then I bought another one and I went bananas, read more than 100 books and went to Antarctica twice in the year 2006.
Okay, you got to slow it down just a little bit for me. You're at, did you say Barstow?
This was in Bakersfield.
Bakersfield.
Yes.
So you're in a bookstore in Bakersfield.
Yes.
You are bored. You
Yes.
walked to a bookstore.
Well, I was driving to my hotel and
Got
I
it.
just saw Barnes & Noble, so I went in.
And then you went to the business section.
Correct.
Because you're a business
That's what
person.
I like to read.
And you saw a geography book in the business section.
I thought a history book.
A history book.
What in the world does a history book have to do with business?
Okay, and I suspect that book had something to do with Mr. Shackleton.
It did. It was the story of the Endurance, Ernest Shackleton's expedition in 1914, when 28 people were going to Antarctica from England with the intent to cross the entire continent on foot. Now, ironically, they never made landfall because the ship got stuck in the ice, and then eventually the ship got crushed and they were stranded, and they eventually got home after being stranded for 2 years.
2 years.
2 years.
Okay, so this guy, Ernest Shackleton. Now, I have this. Cole, let's put this on the screen. I wanted, because there's a little bit of a history lesson here. And so we've got, you can see up here, we've got, there's the man himself.
Yep.
Now he's an explorer, but he was also a businessman. Is that right?
Well, he was leading this expedition.
Yes.
He was the one that had to recruit people and put the finances together and the business plan and all that other stuff.
So you were a recruiter.
I was at the time.
So it kind of,
yeah.
this sounds like a tough job to recruit for.
Well, interestingly enough that you say that, because I thought to myself, I get the fact that one guy wants to do this.
Yeah.
How do you convince 27 other people that this is going to be a good idea?
I don't know.
I mean, that was part of why I had to read the book, I guess, to answer that question.
Okay, so just for the viewers also, so that if you can do some research. I think Ernest Shackleton, I think should be a household name. I really do. I mean, after doing a little research on him myself, and of course his ad, whether or not you know he wrote it or not, is quite famous in the ad world.
Of course it is.
And we'll show everybody what that ad looks like. But he really is an Abe Lincoln type, Babe Ruth type recognition, I would imagine, out in the Irish land. Everybody knows who he is.
Of course, in the United Kingdom, in that part of the world, everybody knows
He's
him,
like
sure.
a legacy superstar,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Out here, lots of people know, but hopefully more will grab
A
onto
lot
it.
of people I run into, they're familiar with the story at a general level, but
Yes.
they don't know the specifics.
That's right. Okay. So a little history lesson. There is the Antarctic Circle. So what does that mean?
The Antarctic Circle is the line of latitude that's 66.5 degrees south on the meridian.
Okay.
So that's the circle. The convergence, in fact, 90% of all the fresh water on Earth lies below the convergence of that 66.5 degree circle.
Okay.
That's how much ice there is down there.
And so I got another close up here. It's just extremely cold there. It says South Pole. So
Yes.
does it ever not get cold there?
I think the record for the highest recorded temperature ever in Antarctica was in the neighborhood of 50 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay. So it's always cold. And how low does it go?
The coldest temperature ever recorded in Antarctica was in, it was either July or August, because that's, they're in the southern hemisphere, so they're opposite of us. So I believe it was in the western part of Antarctica at a Russian science station called Vostok. The actual recorded temperature on the thermometer was minus 129.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes. Real. That's not wind chill, fake temperature. That's real temperature.
I don't even know what to say. This is so cold. Okay. I got one more picture of the history lesson, and then we'll start. This is the ad that we were talking about. It says, men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Who wants to come?
Isn't that a masterpiece?
It's a masterpiece.
It's funny. I was in a speaking engagement a few months back. I think it was in Cleveland. And there was a guy in the room who apparently had heard me speak several years prior. I didn't recognize his face or his name. And he says to me, when we got to this portion of the program, he said to me, Mike, I have to tell you something. I heard you X number of years ago. And what I did, he runs a business that I think is an accounting firm. And they were hiring accountants. And they were struggling. So he said, just for kicks and giggles, I'm going to run this. He literally ran that as it was written in 1914. He thought, I just am just going to throw this in the water just to see a fish bite. I'm not expecting anything. He said, the phone started ringing off the hook. And I said to him, isn't it funny? Sometimes the company that wins is not the biggest company, the best company, or the first company. Sometimes the company that wins is the one that stands 3 or 4 inches above everybody else who drowns in the sea of similarity. I said, that ad just automatically makes you different. And sometimes it's the one that's different that wins.
I love that story.
It's just, and I thought, wow,
Wow. So now, thanks for slowing down for me, because then you moved up to 2006. You went to Antarctic 6 years later.
Correct.
And then you trained for that.
Right.
Why? What did you do? How did you train? What was the mission?
Well, this is really where the story becomes a cartoon, as if it's not already. So I became so enamored, well, let's use the right word, obsessed with Shackleton and these characters. It wasn't just Shackleton. It was Robert Scott, Roald Amundsen. There's a bunch of them from history. I became so inspired by these characters that I literally wanted to walk in their shoes, literally. So what happened was I was online one day. This was in February of 2005. And I came across an article that was written somewhere in the search feed that said, we're going to host a marathon, 26.2 miles. It's going to take place on an ice shelf located 600 miles from the South Pole. It's never been done, ever, in history. And I'm like, what can go wrong with this? So I convinced my wife it was a good idea to sign up. And I signed up. And of course, getting the hall pass for that was, that was another story. No, she's very supportive. So I ended up making the decision to go. And of course now, I'm like, well, I live in San Diego, California. And for those of you listening or watching who are geographically challenged, San Diego is not located in the country of Canada. It's located in Southern California. So 50 degrees is like about as cold as it gets, right?
It sounds freezing to me.
And I'm like, okay, Angela's not going to relocate to International Falls, Minnesota. She's not going to Regina or Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is one of my favorite places in all of the world to go. It's very cold. It's in Canada. And Angela's not going to Oymyakon, Siberia, literally the coldest inhabited town on Earth. January of last year, actual real temperature in Oymyakon, minus 62 degrees.
And people live there.
We're not finished. Centigrade.
Oh my gosh.
Let me help those of you that are from this place called the United States of America. That would be minus 89 degrees Fahrenheit for you Americans. Real temperature on the thermometer. Angela is not going. The only reason I haven't gone, there's a guy over there that makes me a little nervous. His name is Putin. I'm sure I'm not the only one, right? Right? But Angela's not going. So how I got around this one, I literally found a freezer. One day after I'd committed to doing this, I pulled something out of the kitchen cabinet called the Yellow Page phone book. For those of you that are confused on what I'm alluding to, they used to make this really big, thick book page full of phone numbers of businesses. So I pull the Yellow Page phone book out and I look up the word freezer. And I start calling every phone number listed under that word. And the phone call sounded like this. Not kidding. Hi, this is Antarctic Mike. I'm a fan of Ernest Shackleton, and I'm so inspired by this guy, I'm going to follow him to Antarctica, and I'm running a marathon in Antarctica, and I want to train in your freezer. And no, this is not a prank phone call. I'm dead serious. Now, you can see the looks on the other end of that phone call, like, this guy's out of his mind, right? So what happened was this one lady named Jennifer at this place called Miramar Cold Storage, located in San Diego, got really excited. She's like, oh, this is a great story. I would really like to help you, but I can't give you permission. Okay, well, what do we have to do, Jennifer? We have to talk to the manager. Okay, who's that? His name is Josh. Can I talk to him? Can you put me through? No, he's in a meeting. Of course, Josh is always in a meeting, right? So I leave him a voicemail. Does he call back? Of course not. I call him like 10 more times and leave 10 more messages. Does Josh ever return a phone call? Never. So you know what happens what you do when people don't return phone calls? I literally showed up at the door. Now, this is funny. You have to picture this. I'm wearing the fuzzy red parka, the big red parka with the fuzzy hood, the black face mask. I got the mitts, the boots. I mean, I look like the bank robber out of Bismarck, right? Josh answers the door. Guess who? Now you know I'm serious, right? So he gives me this tour of the freezer, and I'm like, we're ready to go, right, Josh? Nope. We got to get permission from the owner of the company. Okay, well, we're here. Let's go talk to him. No, you don't understand, Mike. His name is Tibor. He hardly speaks English. He's from the country of Hungary. And he's only here once a week. He's 80 years old. He's getting ready to retire. He doesn't live in San Diego. Well, where does he live? He lives in Pasadena. Now, for the viewers, from the freezer in San Diego to Pasadena, which is like on the other side of Los Angeles, in traffic, that's like a 6-month drive. And I'm like, how am I going to get around this one? So I finally get a hold of this character named Tibor. I got a hold of him on the phone one day. And he has this very heavy Eastern European accent. I mean, he sounds like Boris Badenoff out of Rocky and Bullwinkle, right? So he has this very heavy accent. He calls me one day and he says, hey, this is Tibor. I hear you want to run in the freezer. Yep. You know, I used to own a business in Antarctic. I'm like, what'd you do down there? Sell cars or houses? Like, what do you mean you had a bit? He goes, I had an engineering company, and we built the closed loop system for all the water and the diesel fuel at McMurdo, the largest research facility on the continent. My response? I knew we had something in common. It's about time I met you. I had no idea what this guy was talking about. He's talking about closed loop systems. I'm thinking of roller coasters, right? I have no idea what he's talking about. And so I talked my way. I finally got permission from him and talked my way into the freezer. Now, the freezer was kind of funny because it's, people ask me, well, was it cold? Well, let's see. They call it a freezer. I think they left a clue, right? Yeah, it was 22 degrees below zero inside that thing. So it's pretty cold. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part, back and forth and back and forth, 59 feet at a time. And people are like, hey, Mike, they make something called a treadmill and they're available to everybody. No. Nothing digital or electric works at minus 22, right? Life stops at minus 22. Yeah. So it's back and forth and back and forth. And people are like, man, I knew this guy was a screwball, but how do you withstand the monotony of going back? I mean, it'd be like being in the studio. I mean, from the wall to the wall, just going back and forth and back and forth. You're training for a 26.2 mile run in a 59-foot frozen metal box. People are like, this is insanity. And I thought the same thing. Until I had a flashback to 1976. So I grew up in a city called Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's about an hour outside of Philadelphia. It was a Thursday night hockey practice. at 623 North Hanover Street. This was the Ice Palace hockey rink. I can see this like it was yesterday. So I had 3 coaches on my team. One of them was a guy named Ed. Ed skates up to me on this random Thursday night hockey practice in 1976. He looks at me and he says, Mike, you're going to play the game the way you practice. If you choose to make the practice harder, the game goes easier. Guy skates away. That was a 15-second encounter at best. Little did I know, 15 of the most important seconds of my entire life showed up at a random Thursday night hockey practice when I was age 11, right? You don't think a kid's life can change forever at age 11. Think again. So really what Ed was telling me, if you think about it, was he was telling me to look at difficulty differently. He was really telling me, Mike, most people run away from difficulty. Maybe you ought to run toward it. Most people see difficulty as an enemy. Maybe you should see it as an ally. And that changed my whole paradigm. And I literally thought about that all those years later in the freezer now in 2005, going back and forth 59 feet at a time in a frozen metal box at minus 22. And I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to start looking at this as something that's to my advantage. And I changed my whole paradigm. And it changed my whole paradigm on what difficulty is and what it isn't. And it's changed forever. And I know this worked because what happened was I ran a marathon inside that freezer before I went to Antarctica. I ran 26.2 miles in a 59-foot frozen metal box, back and forth and back and forth. You know, the hardest part of that was the ball of the foot. Because what would happen was I'd get to the wall and I'd pivot 180 degrees to go back, and I kept pivoting on the ball of the foot. So after a while, you know, it became like leather and it got blistered, and, you know, eventually it just, you know, it became like cement, but it was okay. But that was the hardest part. It was the ball of the foot from the pivoting. But I know it worked because when I got to Antarctica, it took me 7 hours and 15 minutes to run the distance. But when I finished, this was my instinctive thought. Is that all there is? The 7 hours actually seemed more like 7 minutes. And then I had a flashback to the freezer, and I thought, that's where you really built the most important muscle in the human body. It's called the muscle of confidence. It's the most important muscle in the body of any of our listeners. Whether you're an athlete or not is irrelevant. And I'm like, man, that freezer built my mind more than it conditioned me for cold. And that was the real value of the freezer. And I didn't know that going into it until, you know, it's funny how everything's 20/20 in hindsight, and that clearly was 20/20.
That's an amazing story.
It was. I'll tell you, it's funny.
I can see you going back and forth, and I feel for you because that just must have been grueling.
You know, it was and it wasn't. I'll tell you why. Because the imagery in my mind as I kept going, and I spent hours and hours and hours, and I mean, I lived in that freezer. You can imagine
8, 9, 10 hours.
Oh yeah, I'd be in there sometimes all night.
Sure,
I'd be in there on a Saturday and a Sunday. I wouldn't come out till, you know, whenever. It really wasn't that hard because what went through my mind the entire time I was in that freezer was just old black and white pictures like that are on your board. Old black and white video. You know, there's video clips from these expeditions too. All these old video clips and pictures of what it was like 100 years ago. When it was almost like going into a time machine 100 years back. And I lived in that time machine while I trained, and I thought, you know what? I'm getting prepared to follow these guys. And what they did is way harder than what this is, because difficulty is a relative word. And so I just kept that in my mind the whole time, and it really wasn't that bad.
That's amazing.
The time actually passed very quickly in the freezer. I'll tell you, if I win the lottery, you know, people say, I'm going to build my mom a house.
Yeah.
My mom's got a house. She's got a dog and a house and a car, and she's fine. I'm building a freezer.
Big freezer.
I'm building a 59-foot freezer in my garage.
All right, so, gosh, there's so many lessons in there, but let's double-click on this lesson. The enjoyment of a difficult challenge. I mean, the sheer joy of running into something that is complex and difficult, and how much more fun that is than something easy.
You know, it's funny. One of the quotes from Shackleton, I don't know if you've read this one. He said, I love it when things are hard, and I hate it when things are easy. That's directly from Shackleton.
Yeah.
And that became my mindset. And because the way I look at difficulty, it prepares you for the next unknown. It prepares you for the next battle, the next storm, or the next opportunity. And opportunity is all, and getting through any storm is about being conditioned. Because your degree of success is proportional to your degree of being prepared. And I just looked at this as a way to be more prepared, really prepare my mind more than my body. And it really was. It was the greatest mental preparation period of my life ever. And it's permanent now. I mean, it's changed me forever. It's indelible.
So how do companies use this? Do you help companies use this? Are there tools that you can recommend? What is something I could do tomorrow that would make me 1% better?
I'll give you an example. One of the points of Shackleton's story, when that boat left England, they had to go 12,000 miles when they left London, England to get to Antarctica. And when they were less than 100 miles from the coast of Antarctica is when the problem started. The boat got stuck in the ice. And it never became dislodged. And then eventually, under the weight of the ice, it was crushed. And then they survived out on ice floes. And then they eventually got home after 2 years. So when that boat got stuck, originally, they were trying to free the ship. They literally had handsaws and poles and ropes trying to free the ship. And you have to understand, that sea ice was about 6 meters. 6 meters. I'll help the Americans here in a minute. 20 feet of solid sea ice. 20 feet. And you're out there with a handsaw? I mean, that's like standing on the roof of the Marriott Marquis in New York City with a glass of water when the fire's coming. Like, it's just not going to move the needle. And Shackleton knew this was in vain. And so what he did was then he said to his guys, look, just forget the ship. And then he organized a game of soccer. And there's a famous photo you probably remember from the story that they brought back where the guys are in a soccer match and the ship is in the background of the game and it's lodged in the ice. And that photograph, in my opinion, is like the most telling tale lesson of the whole story, because what Shackleton was telling his people was, let it go. Let go of what you can't control. I have this photograph in my house blown up on a canvas that's the size of that screen. It's 2 feet by 3 feet. And Angela and I talk about, my wife and I talk about this all the time. She calls it the picture. And I cannot tell you how many times, and the picture really represents the importance of letting go of what you can't control and focusing on your response to the circumstance of which you have 100% control. And Angela and I have talked about this repeatedly, where we just talk about if there's a problem in our marriage or if there's an issue that a difficulty we're trying to get through, Angela will say, you know what, I looked at the picture for about 20 minutes and it really helped me, because I realized I have to let go of these things I can't control. I've just got to surrender them. And sometimes that's hard to do, but when I look at that picture, I go, well, they did it. Why can't I do it? And there's a lot of things that people have to let go of every day, right? Think about it. I mean, the list is pretty long for most of us. Bad attitudes, regrets, anger, jealousy, failures, the sale that got away that shouldn't have, the thing you said that you shouldn't have said, what you didn't say that you should have. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, right? Letting go is one of the hardest things to do in the world. But yet when I see that picture and I know that sub-story of the bigger story, I go, they did it, I can do it.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
And we could sit here till midnight, and not cover the same thing twice. This story goes so wide and deep, it's just endless. It's like a cave, or I guess in Antarctic terms, it'd be like a crevasse, right? Where it just goes forever, never, never, right?
Okay, so what's next for you? I've kept a little bit of an eye on you. I met you 10 years ago and through LinkedIn and some other things. What do you spend your time on these days, Mike?
Telling the story. But where I'm spending more of my time, let's go back to the ad. Men Wanted for Hazardous Journey. This is a big sticky point of the whole story, because it's a model and an example of how to hire good people. Because you look out here, I used to be a recruiter, a headhunter, right? So I know the excuses. I hear this all the time. Business owners, whining and crying and we can't hire anybody. What do you mean you can't hire anybody? Are they all locked into the witness protection program? No, you don't understand, Mike. There's something called a labor shortage. I was in Toronto not too long ago, and I heard this from the Canadian folks. Labor shortage. And I said, oh, do they abuse that term in Canada like we do in the United States? And they looked at me like, what do you mean? And I said, how many people live in your country? 35 million? How many do you need? I mean, it's like 30. In America, we got 333 million people. What do you mean there's not enough? No, Mike, you don't understand. It's not the number. Well, then what is it? They don't want to work. And I stare at him. And I said, you're right. There's two words you forgot. They don't want to work.
For you.
I didn't even have to answer the question. You see how easy it is? You just answered the question. It's not, I don't ask, the questions I ask are not riddles, right? This is not hard. This is not algebra, okay? And I said to them, why are you not the company that people can't refuse? Why are you not that company? And they look at me like, well, gee, the guy's kind of right, but we hate him because he's right. I mean, it's just, the look on their face was funny. And I said to them, you know why you can't hire good people? Because you haven't given anybody who's good a good reason to say, call this guy or go see this lady or hit stop. I've got to find out more. Because if what they hear from you is more compelling than where they are, guess what they do? They lean in and they call you, or they come and they see you. That's what people do. And when there's enough of them, now you have a game of musical chairs going on, right? And there's some companies I know that are customers of mine, they've got waiting lists of people. And we're not talking about high-paying, glamorous jobs. We're talking about working in hotels, working for plumbing companies, and stuff that's not exactly on the dream job list. And they're waiting in line because these companies are led so well. They have such good cultures. People can't say no. And so, but that ad is an example of how you attract people because it's a compelling story. And I said, look at the efforts that most people put into hiring folks. I mean, if we went online right now and looked at some of this stuff on Indeed or wherever they spend their money to hire people, it's pathetic. They're putting rusty nails on the fishing hook. Because if we, look, I don't eat fish. My wife loves them. I don't eat fish, but I know enough about fishing to know this. If I take a hook and I put a rusty nail on it and I drop it into the school of fish, what happens? Nobody bites. If I take a piece of fresh cut salmon and I put it on the hook and I drop it into the place in the water where there's no fish, what happens? They show up fast, right? And they bite. I said, the reason you folks can't hire anybody good is you're putting rusty nails on the hook and nobody's biting.
Just going through the motions.
Exactly. There's nothing. There's nothing there.
Me too. How would you like to work for Me Too?
The things I see, my favorite one is this. I see these things that say, come grow with us. And I think to myself, your dad spent how much to send you to an Ivy League college and all you can come up with is come grow with us? I'm like, is that what you get for $500,000 or whatever it costs? I'm like, you got to put something on there that's a little more compelling, right? You got to put a story, like a really, really, really compelling story. And people will bite on it because they'll transpose that story right onto themselves and they'll go, I don't know where the hell Waterloo, Iowa is or what these people do, but I'll take 3 of them and I want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
So it's about story. And Shackleton's is a model of a story because that story that he put online to recruit those people, you know how many people responded to that ad? 5,000 people.
No kidding.
5,000 people. And this was not on the internet. This was not on monster.com. This was not on Career Builder. This was not on Indeed. This was in the newspaper in London, England in 1914. 5,000 people. Because it's a story that connects with people at the human level, not the product and the service level. It's a story that affords people a chance to make a difference and not a living. It's a story that affords people a chance to be a part of something that's bigger and more important than themselves. A chance to write the chapter in history instead of reading about somebody else's. And that's what people want today. People out here across the country are looking to make differences. They're looking to be a part of something that's bigger and more compelling than themselves. And when they see that story about that company that affords that opportunity, they go, that's where I want to go. And they go there in droves. It's not rocket science. That's why hiring people is not really that hard. You just got to give the fish something they want to bite on, and boy, they come running. And I learned all that from Shackleton's ad. I mean, the level of depth of the points of that story, they just go from here to the center of the earth, deep. I mean, they really do.
It really speaks to just what drives humans.
Exactly.
What drives humans.
Exactly. Whether you're in Antarctica in 1914 or you're in Orange County in 2023, it doesn't matter.
What drives you.
Yep.
Gosh, Mike, people are so interesting.
I think they are.
They are. No, they are.
They
They
are.
are. Every person is so bloody interesting. And to work in an environment where you're allowed to be interesting seems you'll probably beat 95% of the employers out there just looking for ways to make that happen. So you've inspired me today. I've got some ideas. I'm going to be dangerous ideas. I'm going to give our company a challenge. And one of the challenges is going to be to conquer something very difficult, whether it's at work or somewhere else, and how we can help people. And
when you tackle difficult, it's funny because difficulty is a two-sided coin. One side, it comes by choice. The other, it comes by circumstance. And I always looked at difficulty as the more I choose to do things that are challenging, the more I'm conditioned to be able to master the difficulty when it shows up by circumstance. Because when it shows up by circumstance, there's no choice in the matter. It's right in front of you, and you're going through it whether you like it or not. Yeah. The only question is what are you going to come out like on the other side? The more prepared and conditioned I am, better I come out on the other side. Therefore, if I've chosen to take on things that are more challenging, I've now conditioned myself. Like I've gone to the gym and lifted weights, I'm now more conditioned when that difficulty shows up by circumstance.
That's great. Yeah, not to get off track, but if you follow some of what we do here, you know that we follow this thing called the Pyramid of Success, which is Coach Wooden's.
Right.
And his pinnacle is competitive greatness, which is basically enjoying a difficult challenge.
Yep.
I mean, that is his definition. Seems like the Shackleton guy got a little bit ahead of Coach, since Coach was not, well, kind of a contemporary. Coach was born in the early 1900s.
I almost think of Shackleton as a guy who kind of took a page out of the playbook before there was a playbook.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, really, he just was on to things that
today
people are making millions of dollars on by printing and selling and telling us. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. These ideas have been around forever,
right,
and they've been evidenced through the years of history. And Shackleton's not the only one.
Yeah.
But he's just one that I happen to fall in love with.
He was an early one.
He was.
Yeah, extreme. So, boy, thanks for coming in. Maybe we'll have you back sometime. We'll
talk stories anytime.
That was just, that was fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for taking an interest in me and in Shackleton. It's just, Shackleton's a life changer.
Shackleton's a life changer.
He really is.
Okay, pal.
That's why I named my cat Shackleton. I got 2 cats. One of them is Shackleton.
All right. Well, that's a wrap. And good luck to you. And I'll stay in touch.
Cheers.
You got it.
Thanks, guys.